Yes, good morning. I'm here. Thank
Good
you.
morning. It looks wonderful. Where are you?
In my studio in Berlin. Yes.
Wow, that looks great. So you'll give us now a brief presentation, and we'll have some questions after that. But please take the stage, Nora Al-Badri.
Wonderful. Let me briefly start the presentation. Okay. Maybe please allow me to say a few words in the beginning about my practice, a little bit more generally. It's, I think, important for this work to understand where I'm coming from in a way, because all of my work in a way is based on the hypothesis that the internet, the digital, is like a profound space, which of course emerged originally out of military research, as we all know, but it still offers also very subversive and emancipatory space. The digital to me is like a social practice, a cultural technique in order to decolonize and democratize collections, histories, and to activate artifacts and their ghosts. So as much as we live in a post-colonial world, we also live in a post-digital world. And thus the colonial patina is everywhere, as well as computing is silent but ubiquitous. And I'm interested in the politics of representation with regards to cultural data sets, what you will see, what I will present in a moment. And of course, cultural data sets and cultural institutions. So with my work, I aim to develop and create a form of techno-heritage or speculative or anarchistic archaeology that is emancipatory and decolonial, and where the use of computing is helping us to understand cultural material in new ways, namely through their data sets. So after all, what is very important to me is that the whole debate is not so much about the kind of licenses or questions of digital access to museums, but about who owns the data and who controls it. So the same goes actually for algorithms. So we finally need to get over the assumption, and believe me, here in Germany, I can say it is still very much sticking around, that the modern West is the root of the world's consciousness, or even the place of universality. So today I'll try to exercise with you some kind of recentering, as the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o coined it. So digitization of objects from collections manifested a notion that museums, besides having the monopoly over physical artifacts, objects, also became kind of what we call in Germany Datenkraken, like a data octopus. That means they collect data sets of their possessions, and well, sometimes even data streams of the audiences. That's another thing. But especially here in Germany, we see that those collections, digital ones, behind a paywall and within proprietary systems. So this kind of widespread museum practice here seems to me very anachronistic, because the suggested democratic potential of technology here stands in sharp conflict to the institutional angst of losing relevance, and thus the sovereignty over the interpretation, Deutungshoheit of their collections. One moment. I have to see, I can't go to the next slide. Maybe it works now. I hope it works now. So I started to use this term techno-heritage many years ago, when museums began to digitize large amounts of their collections and then created digital assets or digital artifacts. But the name derives from a law researcher, Sonia Katyal, who wrote about another project of mine, and she did name her article about 3D printing and intellectual copyrights techno-heritage. But to me, I wondered what the term really meant, if it was just a formulation or describing something that was actually independent of the physical object. Something
Nora,
that, yes?
I just want to say, we can't see the picture that you wanted to show us now. I don't, maybe the
you don't see any picture?
Yeah, we see you. It's a wonderful picture, but
no,
we don't see the presentation.
Okay, let me try to do it again. Yeah, there was a problem. Let's see now. Yeah, I was already showing something, but do you see something now?
Now it's great. We'll see.
Okay, then I start with the first image. Okay,
all right,
again.
Great.
Okay, I'm sorry. So this one second. For me, when I was thinking about the term, what it really means in the end, what is important, that the digital object is an object by its own in a way. And it's kind of independent to me of the physical object, and it could be translated, then mediated, used and remixed all over the place, all over the world in a way. So it is a separate entity with its own agency, and that's why I use the term techno-heritage to describe it. And also heritage here, on the other hand, usually is a term that looks into the past, but in this concept, it very much looks not into the past, instead towards another scenario of the future. And rather than preserving something, it can offer a new contribution and be used as a starting point, in my case, for artistic research, but also I think for museum collections. And those digital assets, they can also, or objects, can also add a new layer to the so-called object biography, I believe. And also, yeah, I think in my practice, sounds all very abstract, but in a moment I'll show you what that actually means as an artwork and also as an intervention, I think, into the collections, because it's a kind of form of world making here, where it becomes physical again. And but maybe a pretext, it's very important for me that there is not really a need for the real thing anymore in any case, because regardless, not everyone can visit every museum in the world, or, like in his life, but also not with every passport you can visit every museum. So this techno-heritage is in a way more collective and more inclusive. And the work, General Neuronal Ancestral Sculptures Series and Babylonian Visions, both, and they are a form of generating new objects to a contribution, for example, to a futurity of places like Iraq, and potentially, of course, other places that are currently in a state of destruction. So with this work here, I'm expanding on a decolonial and machine learning based museum practice by generating techno-heritage, which are synthetic and newly generated archaeological artifacts. Yeah, there is a problem with my with the thing, unfortunately, that I can't go through the. That is very weird. 1 second. Let me try again. I don't know why it doesn't work now. Okay. So now it works. It may be some of, if you change me being facilitator of the thing, I can't go through it again, but now it should work. So the objects here, the Neuronal Ancestral Sculpture Series, is more or less about the image that comes out of it. So what you see here, that they are very concrete images, synthetic images, but still images of objects. That is the sculpture. And on the other hand, the other series I will show you, it's more videos, Babylonian Vision, because it talks more about computer and machine vision, looking at the patterns and forms of the specific era. So to get those synthetic images you can see here, what did I do? Last year I was at the EPFL University in Lausanne, where I was artist in resident. It's a technical university, and together with the help of machine learning experts, Nega Forutan and Melika Bejati, we use a pre-trained neural network based on GAN technology, which I will explain in a moment. It's not super complicated, but this neural network basically was trained with 10,000 images from 5 different museum collections, with the largest collections of Mesopotamian, Neo-Sumerian, and Assyrian artifacts in the world. I think there is no need to name the museums because we all know who they are. And the images were in the majority collected through web crawling and scraping. And yes, it's I asked the museums beforehand whether I could use their data sets, but even though I asked, it didn't work. Just 2 of the museums, actually the Metropolitan Museum and the Cleveland Museum, they have an open API, and I could use it through that API. But the other data sets were available anyways. And those are images of the input which was used as a data set to train the neural network, what you can see here. And if you can see the objects, it's a big diversity of the data set. That means very different objects, from figurines, pottery, jewelry, fabrics, and so on. And also we had to do a lot of pre-processing of the data sets to clean them out of the noise to get something out of it. But before I take you to a visual journey to the Babylonic times and the machine dreaming of Babylon, please allow me to briefly introduce this technology. It's more widely known as deepfakes, those general adversarial networks. It's my artistic tool, and I need to kind of explain it in a moment to you, because as you can see here, the machine only doesn't see a single image, but also, of course, only numbers. But what those GANs can actually do is that they can, they're very good in seeing patterns. And of course, like a well-trained and experienced archaeologists, they also might be able to detect the proximate time and place where objects are coming from. And this is very interesting here for this very specific purpose project, let's say. So the machine only sees numbers, but the result, what we get out of it, is a meaningful image for people. So this is another example from how those things are applied in this deep fake technology. It's from the website thispersondoesnotexist.com. It produced, I think, still kind of uncanny images of humans who never existed. So if you train the network with millions of human portraits, it will understand the concept of a portrait and generate new ones, or chairs, or of course antiquities. So GANs and their generated aesthetics certainly tackle all the questions and our understanding and also obsessions, I think, with authenticity, originality, and authorship. So this picture here is not so uncanny, I think, at least. Some are more blurry that you find, but there are means also for other machines to detect whether it's a fake image, like of a non-existent person. And some here you can see in the background, the hair, for example, is blurry, and this is a hint for something like that. But actually, okay, again, okay, now it works. I'm a little bit more interested in the meaning of the generated images than the images itself. So the moment when we see and when we feel them. So I would like to quote here what Ibn Arabi wrote about as visual perception as a meaning that God creates in the eye according to what the viewer intends to see of visible things. And this also directly relates to another quote, what Professor Wendy Shaw wrote: what matters is not the object, but its internalization. So obviously this quote from the Quran does not refer to the image as a representational image, but an image of the whole perceptual realm. And that can be an inner image too. And by abstracting those images, these internal senses interfaces with the intellect. And the intellect here also does mean the heart. What you can see here is the process of learning. So the produce of the machine learning about the objects. And here you can see still the so-called not cleaned data set, because they are the artifacts from the museum, part of it, part of the data set. The small measure tables you all know very well, of course. So the produced images here can be very much photorealistic, but they are no photos, because each one of them is made up from a noise in hundreds of so-called epochs. You see the single epochs here, actually, how it's learning. It's a repetition of learning of the generator via discriminator by the neural network. But then, of course, there is a question: how new and how original are these images really? Is this like verisimilitude, and does it actually matter? Which I think are even much larger questions when it comes to what knowledge and forms in the arts are passed on from generations, and how we are inspired as people, also as artists. And that is why I refer to this one work, to ancestral sculptures, in a literal way through the title, because what we can see through the GANs here are the image semantics of very large visual data sets. And of course, as I showed earlier, the machine only sees numbers and the patterns, not a single image. But in the latent space of the neural network, there is a lot of semantic content that has meaning for the human eye and mind. So those are some of the objects a little bit bigger that came out of it. You can see some are very, very abstract, and it's very difficult to tell where they come from. Some, maybe this one is more like jewelry, pottery, pots, a lot of pots. Yeah, but those are the Babylonian Vision, the machine vision processes that also show you the different versions, in a way, of the objects that the machine can see. And I mean, the thing is probably, but we can talk about it maybe after the thing a little bit more in detail. Those are, I think, when we see images of 10,000 objects, for example, it's very different what we make out of it, what we remember, what kind of patterns, than what the machine actually has in its so-called latent space. So I think that is why I think applying machine intelligence to digital heritage collections, and that's what I would say could be called cultural big data, supplies other more speculative and more abstract insights on the search for a visual language, a form, and a pattern of an era within a specific spatial context. And in this case, it's Babylonian. So for me, the interesting part is the image as an artifact and the visual trace of the past, kind of transcending also time as well as the potentiality of an infinitive series of aesthetic references. It's also, yeah, but I'll come to it in a moment. It's also a Warburgian, purely visual data approach. And I think it's also interesting for me to use those GANs as a tools to really critically examine and investigate that field of archaeology. And yeah, let me go through the videos for a second. So the input images of the databases that I just showed you briefly carry time and memory themselves, like patina, broken pieces, most of them mid to low resolution. So subsequently, the new generated images are synthetic ones as a living memory of the input data. And the generated image at the same time is the artifact. And in a way, it's all what you can see now digital on a screen, but still the materiality of the objects is very important because the input images are images of material objects of our past. And if machine intelligence is seen as a technology that can perform and process our collective memory of the past, it makes sense to apply it to cultural big data and then to generate new objects and images, tracing, circulating image worlds out of it. Also in books, such as the Book of Optics, the Kitab al-Manazir by Ibn al-Haytan, which can be said to be the first book on image theory as well, there are very clear distinctions made between the physical act of seeing and the act of processing, which in the human is the psychological act. So Al-Haytham, he did differentiate between the glancing side and the contemplative side, and both of it is incomplete without the other and its internalization. So here we see the beginnings of image theory traced back to that scholar. But yeah, another very important part for me that inspired me to do this object is the work of Zainab Bahrani, a professor at Columbia University, and she put it like the ancients, for the ancient Mesopotamians, an immediate encounter with the past was possible through the image and artifacts of antiquity, not because works of art represented in a secondary or removed manner, historical or mythological scenes kept in collections, but because of the very direct encounter with the past itself, end of quote. Yeah, and I think this is very true. And that kind of approach towards images and images of antiquities, so-called antiquities, is very different to what I have experienced, at least in our society. But the focus here lies specifically on Iraqi geographical region of the Mesopotamian objects and its artifacts, and it is from my point as a half German, half Iraqi artist, also dedicated to the contemporary Iraq, which is nowadays more like a death world where one is excessively confronted with human as well as cultural losses. And that is, in a way, was my motivation also to do this project in a more narrow sense of that heritage, that I'm seeking a contribution to a futurity, to the place which is characterized more by creation rather than destruction. And of course, it's a form of world making through archives. And one of my assumptions here is that there is a power of a digital object, as it is also practiced among many indigenous groups, that the handling of the digital object is the same as with a material object. And after all, I'd say it is very much about the meaning that we give to the data sets. So actually, when we apply AI-based technologies, one also needs to look at the related indigenous AI protocols too. That as a side note, but I think a very important thing, the best AI systems are those that are actually made and trained from the communities that they've been applied to, of course. That might be very self-evident, but in fact, it is rarely done. And I was wondering in this project how we can visually reassemble patterns of our ancestors and specific eras or places in heritage digitization, such in this case as the richness of Babylonic forms in what is today's Iraq. So it's also like a very purely visual data practice, only without any labels or stuff, and data sculpting without classifications, which are very much usually entrenched into a archaeological practice to locate and to represent and to describe. But here in this practice, I'd call it then speculative archaeology, maybe more. It's the machinic arbitrariness that applied might as well create something very meaningful in challenging the meticulous. And of course, I was also inspired and looked at this Abby Warburg-like visual and computational approach to the forms itself through the input material. One works with memory, time, and images too. My assumption is that today we still relate to those objects and images of our ancestors and the so-called antiquities. And I feel that those objects were actually made for transcending time, and the disconnect towards the ancient is more an imperial endeavor within this heritage discourse. There is a fundamental problem, and that I see at least with time, where collections are designated as ancient or cultures as dead cultures. But many people who live in those spaces, for example, spaces categorized in museums as Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt, still feel related to the objects of the past, and they actually are the living culture. But then the construction of the antique does not really allow for contemporary or social practices, let alone ties. And but until today, which is very, I don't know, wonderful that the objects in or outside of museums resonate with us, and people perceive them with their hearts in a much more spiritual way than we actually think. But let me come to an end by talking about the politics of data sets, which is very important also when those technologies are actually applied to museums or to any place, basically. Here on this figure, you can see what data is actually used usually in training some of these most important neural networks. So you see US and UK make it in the right side, ImageNet more than half of the input. And those numbers, I think, are staggering. And it is an overrepresentation of Western images in training data sets. And it's a real issue because in general, data sets from the global south are much underrepresented in large training data sets, which might be a beautiful and have a beautiful unintended advantage and effect when we talk about things like surveillance and security issues in society, for example, facial recognition, but it also leads to an ever-perpetuating visual dominance of just a few contemporary cultures. So GAN image creation is a way of world making also with connecting to a visual language of the Babylonic past of our ancestors. So where I understand this as a practice of resistance to actually create decolonial databases that are based on data sets of the global south. And here's another example from this real world thing. It's from the paper that is called The Elephant in the Room. I would rather describe it as the colonial elephant in the room. It showcases a family of common failures in this state-of-the-art object detectors. That means if you train it only on global northern data sets, the object recognition will only recognize those within the same context. So if there is an elephant in the room, as on this example images, it won't be able to detect it, even though if it's there. That also shows the not artificial intelligence, but artificial stupidity in a way. And it was also tested, for example, in houses and huts in rural Nigeria, where it is very common that people brush their teeth outside of the house, and where the AI then was not able anymore to understand even that there was a toothbrush outside of the house. This is just another example. But in addition, the thing that sometimes AI is criticized to be very much biased and also have an inherent racist bias is itself, or it has the problem that it is a black box system, which means that it is almost impossible to trace back what the input data was. In my project here, it turns into an advantage because, yes, the chosen museums, they can't make a legal case against this form of image creation because, yes, they will never be able to prove which data sets are actually used. So no one knows where the input data actually comes from. And ironically here, this black box problem can now be used against the colonial machines. And more or less know, it's another thing here for me, which is very important. So I think to finish here, maybe what is very important when we reflect on AI or think about it, it's interesting to see it as a collective consciousness too, and as a collective agency, because it is based on large visual, not just visual, I'm sorry, it's also textual. It can be very different sorts of data sets. But what is important is that it is a collective agency, a collective consciousness. And then we are dealing with what, for example, Marx, he called it general intellect, Foucault called it episteme, or Simondon, trans-individual. As researcher Matteo Pasquinelli once summarized it really neatly, I think. And from an artistic point of view, but also from a museological point of view, I believe this is a very exciting starting point to work with. So while, yes, I'm certainly very much interested in some projects in demystifying technology and tools, but of course, I'm also interested in the mystification and the transcendental aspect of using technology in art itself, and I'm much aware of that paradox. And of course, the last thing I would like to say maybe here is what is the role of machine learning here in processes when we also apply it to archaeological data sets or to museums? It makes patterns visible, as I said, but also those that we didn't know about sometimes, or that are not talked about in a society. So another researcher, Wendy Chun, describes this in her essay, Queering Homophily, that machine learning can offer the generative power of discomfort. And of course, it's true that critics of digitization of cultural heritage believe that the value of the original is diminishing if the access to the digital replicas increases. And I could not disagree more, as you know, also maybe some of my other works like the Nefertiti hack, you see her here, because the digital opens completely new ways of interacting with collections, remixing them, activating, also relating to objects in a more participatory, diverse, and decolonial and collective manner. And I think, the digital copy is no slave to the original, and this is the era of technoheritage. Thank you so much.